And the rocket launch pad has been opened. In moments, the Long March 5 will prepare for liftoff. It's now standing by under the moonlight at the Wenchang Spacecraft Launch Site in the southern Chinese province of Hainan. The rocket will be carrying the Chang'e-5 probe, China's sixth mission to the moon and the second to the last phase of its lunar program. The mission is expected to collect and bring back soil and rock samples. And hello there, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on our special coverage of China's lunar mission. I'm Zhong Shi, coming to you live in Beijing. We'll be joined by guests for some expert analysis and insights. Professor Yang Yuguang of the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation and Xu Yansong, Director General of the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Now, CGTN's Wu Lei is standing by for us at the launch site. Wu Lei, obviously final preparations there at the launch site. What is the mood there? What's happening now?
Exactly, Zhong Shi. Right behind me, about 3 kilometers away, is China's most powerful carrier rocket. The Long March 5 is waiting for the final countdown from the launch director, as the launch window is set to be from 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. this morning, Beijing time. So the Long March 5 rocket will be launched very soon. It will lift China's lunar probe, lunar probe, the Chang'e-5 into Earth-Moon orbit. And so this is China's first lunar sample return mission. And this Long March 5 is it's a fifth mission for the rocket. So the rocket has been quite steady. And earlier I talked with Huang Bing, chief designer of the rocket, on the potential about the rocket's global cooperation in the market. Let's take a listen.
We are always open to sharing Long March 5 with the rest of the world. We have promoted it in other countries. Our application manual for it is also publicly released. Long March 5 is advanced in many aspects, especially in its carrying capacity. So we believe that it can really play an important role in future global space cooperation.
So after this launch, the Long March 5 rocket family will play a key role in China's deep space exploration. Zhong Shi.
Well, China could be making history with this latest lunar mission. There are a lot of stakes riding on this mission. Tell us more about what makes this Chang'e-5 mission particularly special.
I talked to the spokesperson Pei Zhaoyu of this Chang'e-5 mission. He told us that if successful, this mission is expected to create a number of new records in China's space program. For instance, it will be the first time for the Chinese spacecraft to collect and drill lunar samples, and also the first time for the spacecraft to take off on the moon, to dock on the moon orbit, as well as package and bring back the moon samples. So there will be a lot of challenges for the Chinese space programs, and the Chinese scientists aim to bring about 2 kilograms of the lunar soil as well as rocks. So along with hundreds of domestic and foreign reporters, we are all holding our breath and waiting to witness this historical moment together. Zhong Shi.
We're all waiting with breath that is bated. A lot of challenges. We'll be talking with our experts throughout the program about just how to conquer them. CGTN's Wu Lei live for us at the launch site. Wu Lei, thanks so much. With a successful launch, the Chang'e-5 probe will be the first space mission to bring back moon rocks in decades. It is also China's first lunar sample return mission. Our Wang Chao tells us more about the technology behind it.
With a weight of over 8 metric tons, it takes a powerful rocket like the Long March 5 to send Chang'e into the space. If successful, the mission will make China the third country to have retrieved lunar samples, after the United States and the former Soviet Union. Once in the moon's orbit, the probe will separate into 2 parts. The orbiter and the re-entry module will remain stay in place, as the lander and ascender head for the moon. In order for a safe landing, a navigation system has been designed to help it avoid obstacles along the way. After touching down, the lander will drill 2 meters below the moon's surface. A robotic arm will extract roughly 2 kilograms of samples. This is some 6 times more than all previous samples ever collected. The limit is 4 kilograms. Previous lunar missions did a direct return of samples to Earth, but not this time with the Chang'e-5. Samples will be stored in the ascender, which will then dock with the orbiter. Then the samples will be transferred to the returner, waiting in orbit. If successful, it will be the first unmanned rendezvous, some 380,000 kilometers away from Earth. From there, the returner will detach from the orbiter to make the 5,000 kilometers journey back home. But it doesn't stop there. The mission is expected to perform escape re-entry, something like escaping stones on water. It will bounce off the upper atmosphere once to help deal with the high-velocity return. And in the bigger picture, all of this can be seen as a rehearsal for China's biggest missions of all, sending humans to the moon. 王乔 CGTN.
The Long March-5 rocket is currently China's largest launch vehicle. It's been at the Wenchang Launch Site in Hainan for a week in preparation for the Chang'e-5 probe. Now let's find out more about the rocket itself.
It has not been easy for the Long March-5 to arrive at the launch center in South China's Hainan Province. It was taken there from North China's Tianjin city.
The waves along the way were pretty big. The staff members checked the rocket every day, the temperature, humidity, and also to make sure it's fastened tightly. If the tie were loose or the ship were shaking, we would have to fix it in time.
They had to be careful because the rocket has a complicated structure and delicate parts. The rocket was shipped on November 17, and after 6 days, it finally arrived in Hainan. Its mission is to deliver the Chang'e-5 probe into orbit.
The completion of the Chang'e-5's mission is not only the conclusion of the third phase in the lunar exploration program. It is also the conclusion of major space projects defined in the 13th five-year plan. It will lay the technological and material foundations for the 14th five-year plan and planet exploration projects in the future. This all makes the completion of this project meaningful and significant.
Developed by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, the Long March-5 rocket is the first Chinese launch vehicle designed from scratch. It is also China's tallest, biggest, and most powerful rocket. Worldwide, it is the third most powerful orbital launch vehicle that is now in operation. Chuck Tintis, CGTN.
And now let's take a look at the Wenchang Spacecraft Launch Site in China's Hainan Province. It is mainly used for China's Long March-5 and Long March-7 rockets. It can ensure high efficiency due to its low latitude location. China's aerospace authorities say the spacecraft launched from Wenchang have some 10% higher carrying capacity compared to those launched from other sites in the country. It will also be safer to conduct lunar missions there, as fallen objects will drop into the sea, helping to avoid the evacuation of local residents. Rockets can also be transported by sea, so there won't be any size limit for their components. And now, let's bring in our guests, Professor Yang Yuguang of the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation and Xu Yansong from the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Gentlemen, I'm so happy to have you on today. Your expertise and analysis will be much appreciated in our special coverage. Professor Yang, I want to start with you. Let's talk about the Long March-5 rocket here. This is China's heavy lift rocket. It's larger in size, affectionately known as the Fat Five, actually among space program and rocket fans. Why do we need Long March-5 for this mission in particular?
Well, you see, Long March-5, together with the Long March-3A series, are used for launching spacecraft with very high altitude. You know that Chang'e-1 and Chang'e-2 are orbiters to the moon, and both have the mass of about 2 more tons. So the Long March-3A and Long March-3C are powerful enough to launch this kind of spacecraft. Well, for Chang'e 3 and 4, because both landers are much heavier with a mass about 3.78 tons, so only Long March 3B B can launch these payloads into the Earth-Moon transfer orbit. Well, for this Chang'e-5 spacecraft, which has a mass about 8.2 tons, it is already exceeds the capability of Long March 3A series. So we don't have other choices. Only Long March 5 has the capability to launch so heavy payload to the lunar orbit. And you see that Long March 5 have a capability of about 14 tons to the geosynchronous transfer orbit, while for an object to the moon will be about 8.3 tons. So this is already powerful enough for this spacecraft.
It has a lot to do with the weight of what you're carrying into this space. Mr. Xu, how does the Long March 5 compare with other heavy lift rockets that China has?
Well, China has the only heavy lifting launch vehicle would be Long March 5, and currently we're developing a new generation launch vehicle. But in comparison with the international launch vehicles, we do have Ariane 5 and Falcon Heavy, which are comparative to the Long March 5. Each have different characters. The Falcon Heavy is using a single rocket engine, but with varieties of numbers. And the Ariane 5 is using solid propellant boosters, as well as liquid kerosene, and liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen as a core. So the core is similar to Ariane 5, and similar to that, we also have the shipment, as the video have just mentioned, from Tianjin to Haikou but also in the European Ariane 5, they're using ships to ship the rocket to the launch site in French Guiana. So there are many similarities, but also there are big differences in terms of payload capacities, in terms of fuels and rocket configurations.
These rockets you mentioned, they vary and differ in size and in shape, and sometimes in the number of boosters they have. Is there consensus maybe on the reliability of a particular rocket?
Well, each rocket needs to have experiences, number of launches that counts in your account. For example, the Long March 5 is only the number 5 time for its launch, but the Arianes and the Falcons has many in their logbook already launched, and success and failures. So they have more experiences and expertise in the rocket configuration, rocket designs and details, and also softwares. So the Long March 5 is a new rocket, still relatively new, and so we need to have accumulation of number of launches to further increase its reliability.
All right, thank you so much. The Chang'e-5 mission is about to make China the first nation to collect lunar soil and rock samples in over 40 years. But what's the craft itself like, and what challenges does the mission face? For this, our reporter Dong Xue has the details.
No spacecraft has brought back moon rock samples to Earth since the last Soviet mission in 1976. China's Chang'e-5 will soon take on the challenge. The craft mission is to collect samples from Mount Rummikub region on near side of the moon and bring them back. The 8.2 metric ton Chang'e-5 is comprised of 4 modules: a lander, ascender, orbiter, and returner. After launching, Chang'e-5 will arrive at the moon after about 3 days. Once it enters lunar orbit, the lander and ascender combination will separate and descend close to the Mount Rummikub. This is a 1,300-meter high volcanic complex in the moon's northern region, made up of vast dark lava plains. Over the course of 14 days, the lander's robotic arm will scoop up surface samples, and a drill will retrieve cores down to 2 meters. Scientists are hoping to collect 2 kilograms of material. However, analysts say the mission is technically challenging and many things could go wrong. The lander could crash land or top over, and the samples could escape from their canisters along the way. The descent and ascent will take place over 1 lunar day, which is equivalent to around 14 Earth days. This brings up the question of how to avoid the extreme overnight temperatures that could damage electronics. The deputy chief designer of China's lunar exploration program says other challenges include the sampling and following stages, because gravity on the moon is about only 1/6 of the Earth's. Under such circumstances, the packaging of samples becomes a key issue which the mission has never tried before.
The Chinese lunar exploration program is an ongoing series of robotic missions. Its nickname, Chang'e, comes after a mythical figure who is believed to live on the moon. Let's now take a look at the milestones in China's attempt to explore the moon.
The ambitious Chang'e program started in 2004. It consists of 3 phases: orbiting, landing, and returning. The first goal is to orbit the moon. In 2007, China launched the Chang'e-1 satellite. After spending 16 months in orbit, the satellite successfully concluded its mission with a controlled crash into the lunar surface. The Chang'e-1 also obtained a full image of the surface of the moon. The Chang'e-2 was sent into the moon's orbit in 2010. As NASA notes, this marked the first time a Chinese lunar probe directly entered the Earth-Moon transfer orbit without circling the Earth first. It captured the world's first full lunar map with a spatial resolution of 7 meters, showing more details of the moon's surface. The second phase is to achieve soft landing on the moon and automatic inspection. The Chang'e-3 was launched in 2013. It carried with it an unmanned rover called Yutu, or Jade Rabbit, which in folklore was Chang'e's pet. It was the first soft landing on the moon since 1976, making China only the 3rd country to achieve the feat after the US and the former Soviet Union. Next up, the Chang'e-4 mission started in May 2018, when relay satellite Chang'e-5 was propelled into orbit. It was sent to set up a communication link between Earth and the upcoming Chang'e-4 lunar probe. It stayed in a geosynchronous orbit on the far side of the moon. 7 months later, Chang'e-4 with a lander and a rover went into space. After a month-long journey, the probe landed on the far side of the moon, which is never visible from Earth, and China became the first country ever to manage the feat. The Yutu-2 rover carried multiple equipment working as a CT scanner. It obtained deep lunar materials directly through on-site exploration, revealing the complex geological evolution on the moon. Chinese President Xi Jinping congratulated the country's scientists on this historic achievement.
太空探索永无止境，希望广大科技工作者、航天工作者
There is no end to space exploration. Our country's scientists and engineers should ride on the wave of the Chang'e-4 mission to achieve the ultimate goal of China's lunar program. You should make more efforts to push forward the international aerospace exploration and bring more Chinese wisdom and power to the peaceful use of space and the building of a community with a shared future for humanity.
Now the Chang'e-5 will try to accomplish the 3rd phase of the lunar program, a return mission to collect soil and rock samples back to Earth. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
And now let's continue our discussion with my guests, Professor Yang Yuguang and Mr. Xu Yansong. We just heard from the Chinese president who encouraged scientists to build on Chang'e-4 and strive for more achievements. If you look at China's lunar probe program in general, this program was inaugurated back in 2004, and now 16 years later, we're sending the Chang'e-5 probe to collect samples and return them from the moon. Professor Yang, how would you categorize China's achievements in the last 16 years, especially regarding the previous 4 Chang'e missions?
Well, to discuss this question, we should be aware that China is still a developing country. Although we've already been a very big country in space field, we have a very large-scale space industry, and we achieved the top 1 launch times this year and last year. But still, for a developing country, we still have only limited goal in this kind of scientific research. So you see, Chang'e-1 and Chang'e-2 use the very practical Dongfang 3 satellite platforms as a base. So it used only a little money to develop this kind of projects and achieve the goal of orbiting the moon. In this procedure, we master the technology of the Earth-Moon transfer and also the orbit insertion from outer moon. Because you see, if a spacecraft approaching the moon, if it do not have an orbit maneuver, it will fly by the moon and do not entering the lunar orbit. So this is a very critical point for China aerospace at that moment. We mastered this technology from the Chang'e-1 and the Chang'e-2 mission. For the Chang'e-3 and the Chang'e-4 mission, you know that the moon is a very large celestial body, and the orbiting speed is about 1,060 meters per second. So landing on the moon need a very large-scale propulsion system and sling down the spacecraft and land on the surface, which have a very large rapid speed. So you see there is the distance between the Earth and the moon is more than 380,000 kilometers. So there is a delay between the telemetry, the data link. So the spacecraft should be highly autonomous. So we master this soft landing technology. You see, these 3 missions made a very good base for this Chang'e-5 mission. And also we have another particular mission called the Chang'e-5 T1. With this mission, we master the technology for re-entry capital to return from the moon to the Earth with speed approaching the second cosmic velocity, and also the technology of skip re-entry. So this is also very particular in our plans, because we need to land on the Inner Mongolia. Which is necessary to use the skip re-entry. So you see, these projects before are very important for this Chang'e-5 mission.
It is a very gradual process, isn't it? With baby steps achieved each way. We've gone from orbiting to landing and now to returning, if all goes well. Mr. Xu, what do you think of these achievements in the past 16 years?
Well, I was there at the beginning when we were drafting this plan of orbiting, landing and sample return. This is certainly a technological demonstration of the capacities and capabilities we have. And now, after the successful orbiting and landing, we have been very innovative because the orbiting, the Chang'e-1 and Chang'e-2 are in fact redundancy programs. The Chang'e-2 is redundancy for Chang'e-1, and Chang'e-4 is a backup of Chang'e-3. So once we achieve the success of the first mission, the second mission has always been very innovative and creative. The Chang'e-2 has been diverted to a celestial body that is very far away from Earth, which is the most distance that we travel by a space object, a spacecraft. The Chang'e-4 has been landing on the far side of the moon, which is unprecedented in the Earth, based on the success of Chang'e-3. So Chang'e-5 is, with a sample return mission, will also be very creative, and also has not been achieved in the past 44 years. So the last sample was returned in 1976 by this former Soviet Union. So we're expecting a success of Chang'e-5 and also looking forward to a more innovative ideas of Chang'e-6 mission, which could be on the polar region or could be a very open project for international cooperation.
It is a very creative project mission, as you mentioned, but one that's with many, many challenges to come. Bear with me here on our program. We'll be coming back and talk about the challenges also later on. In China's aerospace industry is a hotbed for young talent. In particular, a growing number of female engineers are playing an increasingly important role in the missions. CGTN's Wu Lei met with a female assistant engineer who participated in the Chang'e-5 lunar mission at the Wenchang Spacecraft Launch Site. Here is her story.
它是一个很复杂的任务，而且它带有了嫦娥奔月这种古代神话一样的浪漫色彩。 之前总觉得这一类的工作都是特别高端、特别高大上，但是我们想象中的这些其实都是由这些很基础的工作构成的。我叫崔一涵，今年23岁，我在这边工作已经有3年了，差不多一直都是在从事指挥显示的工作，把发射场各种数据信息转发到需要使用这些数据的地方。因为我其实平时就比较爱好穿这些衣服，平时工作的时候都要穿固定的工作的衣服，到了周末能穿自己的衣服的时候，就想穿得更随心所欲一点。我是最近不久才刚刚开始画的，非常能让人提升可以专注的能力。我们这个整个行业系统里，可能女性不是特别的多，可能就不到1/10。我们这个团队它非常的年轻化，绝大多数都是在28、9岁、30岁这个年龄段，思维也会比较活跃。我们的工作其实并没有什么严格的性别限制，如果有这方面的爱好、兴趣，想从事这方面工作的女性，都可以来尝试加入我们。
And while China is making progress in lunar exploration, other countries are also joining the race. One of the frontrunners, obviously, the United States. Let's now hand it over to my colleague Gerald Tan in D.C. to find out more about just that. Gerald.
Thanks, Zhongshe. Well, here in the U.S., President Donald Trump made space exploration a priority when he first took office, but other pressing issues took center stage. Now, NASA's goal to return to the moon is still within reach, as John Zarella explains.
Picking up some dust.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Landed on the moon more than 50 years ago in July of 1969. 3 years later, Apollo 17 left the lunar surface. Humans have not been back since. Over the years, U.S. presidents paid lip service to the notion of returning, but there never was much genuine enthusiasm. Then, President Donald Trump made moon missions a space priority.
This time, we will not only plant our flag and leave our footprint, we will establish a foundation for an eventual mission to Mars.
The plan is ambitious. Jim Bridenstine, who heads the U.S. space agency NASA, says this time it's far more than a quick round trip.
I don't like using the word that we're going back to the moon. We're not. We're going forward to the moon. We're doing it in a way that's never been done before.
The idea is to make landers, rovers, spacecraft all have access to the moon over and over. NASA, its partner nations, and commercial companies would create an architecture revolving around a central hub.
We need every part of the architecture between Earth and the moon to be reusable. We need the launchers to be reusable. We need the tugs that go from Earth orbit to lunar orbit to be reusable. We need the gateway.
The gateway is the hub, a small $2.7 billion station orbiting the moon. It would serve to test new technologies, provide easier access to the moon for landers and astronauts to come and go. NASA has dubbed its new moon program Artemis. The goal? A 2024 landing.
We will get to the South Pole of the moon by 2024, landing the first American woman and the next man.
Ambitious? That might be an understatement. NASA's massive new deep space rocket called the SLS has yet to fly. And landers to bring the astronauts to and from the moon's surface? They're just concepts. There are other flies in the ointment, too. Administrator Bridenstine says he will not stay at NASA after the next administration takes over in January. And the next NASA chief may have different priorities and marching orders than getting to the moon in 4 years. John Zarella, CGTN, Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Let's speak more about this with James Head. He's a professor of the Department of Earth, Environmental and Planetary Sciences at Brown University. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we just heard there the ambitious Artemis program by NASA to return to the moon in 4 years. In your view, how likely is it to succeed?
Well, I think the Artemis program will succeed. If you had asked me in the 1960s whether we would land a human on the moon by the end of the decade, I would have said, gee, you're crazy. But that was my first job, and we did it. We did it for all humankind. So I think anything is possible if you put your mind to it.
Right. Well, Professor, the report also mentions the domestic political reality of the U.S. space program and how it's tied to who's in the White House. We're seeing a new president in less than 2 months, and the focus right now very much on confronting the pandemic. So what's the appetite for space exploration?
I think space exploration in the United States is one of the key topics that everybody supports. It's very bipartisan support for space. Everybody remembers, of course, Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, all the successes of the multiple Apollo missions, scientific expeditions to the moon. And indeed, this is something that will continue under any administration because it's very bipartisan support. And China is doing a great job here in terms of their first sample return mission. This is incredible. We haven't been returning samples for 44 years, and we have many scientific questions which the Chang'e-5 mission is going to help us answer. This is really exciting opportunity, and we really appreciate China's efforts in this area.
Last month, the U.S. also signed the Artemis Accords with several nations. These are ostensibly guidelines for nations who want to cooperate with NASA on the moon. But critics argue differently, saying the U.S. is trying to control space resources. Is that fair?
Oh, I don't think it's fair at all. I think the Artemis Accords are very inclusive, and I'm confident in the future with future administrations and as we move forward that hopefully China can be involved as well. And science is very international. Space exploration is very international. It's very expensive. It requires a lot of efforts and also teamwork and very, multiple ideas about how to accomplish things. And I think that the future, international collaboration and cooperation is the way to go.
All right, and we look forward to that. Professor James Hitt, we thank you so much for your time. Well, that's it for me for now. Gerald Tan here in Washington, D.C. Let's go back to Zhongshe in Beijing and our continued coverage of the Chang'e-5 lunar mission.
Gerald, thanks so much for that report. We were showing you live pictures from the launch site in Wenchang in Hainan Province. As you can see, all seems to be ready for that rocket to launch. That is a Long March 5 rocket. We expect it to be launched at 12 seconds past 4:30 Beijing time, which is less than 20 minutes away. We're keeping a close watch for you, and we'll bring you all the latest from the launch site there in Wenchang. Keep it right here on CGTN. All right, meanwhile, Russia is preparing for the next phase of its own lunar program, and to talk us through the country's latest efforts to explore the moon, let's talk to our correspondent Julia Chapman. Julia, it seems Russia has some rather ambitious goals. What can you tell us?
It does indeed, that's right. The next phase of Russia's lunar exploration program is due to get underway next year. If everything goes according to plan, a spacecraft will launch from Russia on October 1st, 2021, and that will be the first of 3 planned missions to the moon, all unmanned, but very similar to what China is doing at the moment. The next one would arrive on the moon and take samples of the moon, bringing them back to Earth if everything goes well. And of course, Russia has a long history of lunar exploration. The Soviet Union was, of course, the first country to carry out both a hard and soft landing on the moon, only to be eclipsed by the United States when the US first put man on the moon a decade after Russia got there first. So in recent years, Russia has been turning its attention to other projects in space. In recent years, projects like the International Space Station have taken priority, and lunar exploration has been somewhat eclipsed. But Russia's space agency Roscosmos has big plans. It aims to put cosmonauts on the moon from 2030 and ultimately create a permanent base there. And although it requires significant funding, scientists insist the project is worthwhile.
As for what we gain from studying the moon, there have been arguments, there still are. Some think that there isn't a clear scientific goal, but actually there is, it's just not obvious to the wider public. After completing these tasks, you can consider developing technology that will allow for humans to fly to Mars. That's what Elon Musk is talking about. It sounds like science fiction, but the moon program is needed so that it becomes a reality.
Next year, Russia will relaunch its lunar program. The Luna-25 mission will study the surface of the moon and bring samples back to Earth. China and Russia have agreed to work together on lunar research. As the world ramps up its lunar expeditions, space explorers continue to set their sights even higher. So Luna-25 will be launching next year if everything goes to plan for Roscosmos, and that's going to be in conjunction with the European Space Agency. But Russia is certainly looking for other partners as its cooperation with the United States has been slowing down recently. The US no longer depending on Russia to send humans to the International Space Station, now using its own private space companies in America. And Russia and China have signed agreements already to create a lunar data research center, and that will have hubs in both China and in Russia. So Russia's certainly looking for other partners, and China with its new lunar exploration programs certainly looks like an opportune candidate.
Julia, thanks so much for that report. And now for further analysis, I want to go to Mark McCorian, Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency. Thank you so much for making time for us. Europe is a key player in space exploration. What do you think is in store for Europe in terms of lunar exploration in particular?
Well, it's a very exciting night for Europe as much as it is for China, because we're actually supporting the Chang'e-5 mission tonight with our deep space tracking networks. But beyond that, our real programs at the moment, at least, are with NASA in the US and Roscosmos in Russia. And we're already building hardware for going back to the moon. It's called the European Service Module, which will help take humans back to the moon in the next few years. And we're also starting now, we've put the contracts out to build components, key modules of the Gateway, the small space station that will be in orbit around the moon and will be the way of getting to the surface of the moon. So we'll be sending astronauts there to the Gateway to do science. We also have robotic missions, which will be going to enable communications, navigation and transportation to the Gateway and to the surface of the moon. And we're also working on science and technology, which will help us extract, for example, water, oxygen and metals from the surface of the moon, resources in situ, which we can use then to support a future human base, for example.
Mr. McCorian, I was talking with my guests here in our studio who said that in the future lunar probes, in Chang'e missions in the future, there could be more international cooperation. Would Europe be interested in working with China, not just with the lunar probes, the Chang'e missions, but also in other aspects of space exploration?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, we already have collaborations with China from the European Space Agency. Some of our astronauts have traveled to train with Chinese astronauts, and there's the possibility of European astronauts perhaps flying to the next Chinese space station. We're involved in collaborations on Earth observation, looking down at resources on the planet Earth. And currently, for science, we're building a new satellite to investigate what we call the magnetosphere, the near-Earth environment where the particles from the sun hit the magnetic field of the Earth. That's a joint mission between China and ESA called SMILE. And of course, we're very interested in the south pole of the moon, as many people are, perhaps a destination for Chang'e-6, because that's where ice may live still today, unaffected by sunlight, hiding in the dark craters at the south pole of the moon. And of course, that would be vital for a future human base. So we're already working with China and certainly very interested in exploring new opportunities.
And we look forward to more cooperation in the future. That's Mark McCorian, Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency. We thank you so much for making time for us today. And let's head back to my guests here in the studio. We talked about past achievements in China's lunar probe, and now we want to focus on this Chang'e-5 mission in particular. This will be as many analysts have pointed out, the most complex of the Chang'e mission so far. Professor Yang, in what way will this mission be particularly complex?
In the previous introduction, it already mentioned the lunar 24 mission, which is the last sample return from the moon since 1976. So you see that the former Soviet Union has performed 3 successful sample return missions: Lunar 16, Lunar 20.
1 second, Professor Yang. We're hearing from the Command and Control Center that 15 minutes until launch. We're hearing instructions coming from the Command and Control Center that we're now 15 minutes from the launch of the rocket. Please continue.
Well, these 3 missions brings about more than 300 grams of samples from the moon. So you see, these missions choose a relatively simple method. The probe directly ascend from the lunar surface and directly come back to the Earth. So that is the reason it only brings so little samples to the Earth. So this time, to bring more samples to the Earth, we choose a different method: lunar orbit rendezvous. So you see, because the re-entry capsule needs some heating shield to protect it from the high friction, the heat from the friction with the atmosphere. So these kind of measures are not necessary for the sampling on the lunar surface. Well, on the lunar surface, there are different considerations. So the spacecraft of the re-entry capsule and the ascender are quite different. We choose a lunar orbit rendezvous, which is much complex than the former Soviet Union missions, and this is very similar to the Apollo programs. You can recognize the lander and the ascender as the descent pad and the ascending pad of the lunar module of the Apollo spaceship. You can recognize that the orbiter as the service module of the Apollo spaceship, and the returner or the re-entry capsule as the command module of the Apollo program. So this mission, although it is an unmanned mission, but the configuration and the mission profile is quite similar to the Apollo program, really complex. And to my understanding, the most challenging part will be the lunar orbit rendezvous. As the previous introduction, it will be the first unmanned lunar orbit rendezvous and docking. No one has done this before. It is quite challenging, and because you see, to rendezvous and docking near the Earth, we have all kinds of support. We can have ground stations, we have data relay satellites, and we have the GNSS or the navigation satellite system to support these kind of missions. But for the docking and rendezvous near the moon, we don't have so much support. We only mainly depends on the spacecraft itself and limited support from the ground. So this is also very complex and really tough. This is with very high risk. So you see, this program is very, very complex, but we have advantage. We can have more samples. As introduced, we can have 2 kilograms of samples potentially, which will be more greater than the total sum of the samples get by the former Soviet Union 3 missions. So you see, with this mission, we will master many new technologies, and will be a good preparation for the potential future manned missions to the moon.
We're all very excited about this mission, and precisely because of all of those firsts that China is endeavoring to achieve, of all of those challenges, and much of the tension from people here in China and abroad will be focused on how China will rise up to the challenge. Mr. Xu, your take on what will people be looking out for in this mission, and what will be the biggest potential challenges as we move forward?
Well, I think this is a clear demonstration of technologies for preparation of human missions. In the world, we do have 2 different mentalities. One is for robotic missions to explore outer space. Another intention is to humanly explore outer space. We saw just now the programs of Artemis, or the Gateway, the US has called it. The concept is to build a lunar space station where it will orbit the moon, and then they will have multiple missions of sample return to the Gateway, and then the samples will be selected and filtered by human missions, and then human mission will bring the samples back to the Earth. That is the configuration of the gateway. What we're doing is to demonstrate the capability of going back to the moon, bring samples back to Earth, and these samples can be replaced by human, so that in the future we can enlarge or blow up this model and achieve a human mission. So this is something that we could look forward to in this Chang'e-5 mission.
Let's briefly talk about the whole process here, because that will be important for our viewers to understand. We're also hearing from the ground command center that it's now 10 minutes away from the launch. We're keeping a close watch on that as well. So in a nutshell, we'll be bringing in soil and rock samples from the moon. How do we do that? So this probe, the spacecraft, will be made up of 4 components. There will be a lander, there will be an ascender, there will be a service module or an orbiter that will be waiting for the ascender after it collects the samples, and then that return capsule that basically hauls back everything it collects from the moon and return to Earth. In terms of these 4 components and the steps connecting each of them, what do we know about potential risks? What do we know about where it could go well, where it could go wrong, because we haven't done that before? This will be the very first time, Professor.
Well, in fact, every procedure in this mission will be very challenging and risky, although we've already done that before. For instance, the Long March 5 need to send the spacecraft to the Earth-Moon transfer orbit. During this process, we need 2 to 3 mid-course correction, because you see the accuracy of the rockets is not enough for the for the spacecraft. The orbit insertion near the moon will be very critical, so we need a mid-course correction by a very accurate measure of the orbit, and then do this. And the orbit insertion is also very challenging, although all the 4 missions have done that before. But still, because we need a large velocity increment in this lunar orbit insertion, so it is also very challenging. And lowering down the orbit to the moon, and then the separation between the 4 parts. As I mentioned, the descent, the lander, and the ascender and the lunar module. So the separation is also a very critical point for this mission. And the landing on the moon, you see, always be very, very dangerous. And Israel and India has just suffered failure not very long ago. So sampling on the moon is also very difficult, because you see the lunar surface, the environment is very crucial. The temperature is very high under the sunshine, is very low, and in the shadows we must consider, and also consider the influence of the dust on the moon to the spacecraft. And the sampling, as we see, we need to drill 2 meters under the ground, and also we have a scoop to scoop up the reckless to the spacecraft. And the ascender, the package, is also very, very important, because any leakage could cause the loss of the samples. So the package must have a very complete sealing and be done properly. And ascending itself is also very challenging. You see, we never done this before to lift off from another celestial body. The problem is that because there are always errors, so the coordinate of the landing site, we don't know that, because we need to measure that after landing. And only after this we can have the coordinate of the where we lift off, and also the angles of the slope also have influence to this procedure. So all kind of influences as factors, we must consider that carefully for this liftoff. And also, as I mentioned, the rendezvous itself is near the cislunar space is the most difficult part, from my point of view. And also the return itself is quite difficult.
Although we're witnessing the rocket launch today, what will be more challenging will be what happens on the moon after that lander makes itself on that moon. And all of this will have to happen in the time frame of 1 lunar day. That's 14 days on Earth. Do we have to worry about that time frame to get all of this accomplished, Mr. Xu?
Well, I think timing is very important in this mission. We also Professor Yang has just mentioned there are many challenges in the details, in the landing and the ascending. This particular mission is different from Chang'e-3 and Chang'e-4 landing mission because this has an ascender which has a higher gravity center of gravity, which means it might be tumbling if the surface is not flat. So the autonomous terrain selection system and validation system is very important. So once, as you mentioned, the timing of this mission, you have to validate the landing site by the spacecraft itself during its orbiting to the lunar surface, and then make a final decision on the landing site. There are 3 or 4 landing sites that can be chosen from, and then you will have this landing. Once it's successful on the flat base, you will have another challenge of ascending these samples and rendezvous to the return capsule and the orbiter. So all of these are done without human interference, without navigation systems, without any assistance on the ground. So these are very challenging and very time-demanding and precision-demanding mission.
It looks like we're less than 5 minutes away from the launch of that rocket. We'll take you to the Wenchang launch site as that happens, so make sure you keep it with us right here on CGTN. Let's talk about the part where the lander is responsible for the digging and for the collecting and the sampling. It will do so with robotic arms. Is that process fully automated? Is there any interference from, let's say, humans on Earth for that process?
There are 2 instruments that we brought to the lander. One is the visible and near infrared camera that can help, as Professor Yang mentioned, the scooping of samples on the lunar surface. Another one is a radar, a penetrating radar that can penetrate the ground, that can tell the character of the ground and the hardness and the softness of the ground, so that the drill can drill 2 meters into the ground and bring samples back. So there are 2 different methods of collecting samples at the same time. We do bring these 2 instruments on board. We might analyze on the ground by these parameters and informations prior, during, and after the drill.
All right, it looks like we're just moments away from the launch of that rocket. This is a Long March 5 rocket. We're now 3 minutes away from the launch here. When we talk about what's going to happen on the moon later in this mission, people say that the docking and the rendezvous, as Professor Yang mentioned, is extremely difficult. Help us understand how that process will happen and what should we look out for?
Well, for lunar orbit rendezvous and docking, first you should have a very accurate measurement. So you see we have all kinds of instruments such as docking and rendezvous radar, which is, you can recognize that as a derivative from the docking and rendezvous radar of the Shenzhou spaceship, but it is a much smaller version. Also, it has a new function to have vehicle-to-vehicle communication, which can exchange data. So you see, this instrument is very critical for our lunar orbit rendezvous and docking. One side from the ascender and one side from the orbiter. With this instrument, we can help the 2 spacecraft to measure the distance from each other and also measure the angles. And then from the final step, the 2 spacecraft should docking autonomously with the docking mechanism, which is quite different from the mechanism we used by the Shenzhou spaceship and our space station. Or from the front, we can hear that it's 2 minutes counting down, T-minus 2 minutes counting down. And I believe that the spacecraft has changed the power supply from the launch pad to the vehicle itself. And the onboard computer will also have the control of all the critical functions.
Professor Yang, that's the platform, that's the pad opening up to release the rocket, is it?
Yes, we can see that all the rotational platforms has already been opened, and only a few connections are still remain. So we can see it's going to launch,
indicating that the final preparation, the very final touches are now being done to the rocket.
You can see there's still a wire connected to the vehicle. That is a wire to have the measures.
1 minute countdown till launch. If you're just joining us here on CGTN, you're looking at live pictures coming out of Wenchang and Hainan Province, where the Long March 5 rocket is getting ready to lift off. This is the Chang'e Chang'e-5 mission that will endeavor to bring back soil and rock samples from the moon. 30 seconds till launch.
$20.
20 seconds now.
明白。
As you can see, the countdown on the screen.
10,
10, 9, 8,
7,
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Lift
起飞时
off.
间：动4时3度分2幺秒，发动6毫秒。程序转弯。阵地1212跟踪正常。
Personnel on the ground reporting that the remote sensing data indicate that the flight is going smoothly. Why do we need those data?
This is to keep the tracking of the predetermined orbits and the speed and altitude, so to keep track on the normality of this rocket.
And we should also notice that the rocket is not flying straight up; it's going sideways. There's a little turn.
It's called pitch over.
Pitch over.
Yes. So the first critical step will be after the tower is cleared, will be the pitch over to the so we call the launch direction. With this direction, we can determine the orbital plane. And from you see, this is a video from the camera mounted on the rocket itself on the core stage. We can see 2 of the 4 boosters. Well, the 4 boosters provided 90% of the thrust during the liftoff. So on this stage, mainly the thrust is from the 4 boosters. And after pitch over, the next critical step will be the separation of these 4 boosters.
Yes.
Yes. Exactly.
And we keep hearing that the monitoring and command center reporting how the flight is going to continue. They're going to continue to track the flight of this rocket, and then a few minutes into its flight, we'll see the boosters come off the rocket, and you're looking at the pictures being captured by a camera just attached to the body of that rocket, showing, as Professor Yang mentioned, 2 of the boosters there. There are a total of 4 boosters on the body of the rocket. They will all come off later in the flight and allow the separation of the first and second stage rockets.
So each of the booster has 2 engines, so total of 8 engines on the booster, and also engines on the core stage. So the boosters are composed by liquid kerosene, liquid oxygen rocket engine, but the core is cryogenic, which is liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen.
Help us understand the choice of fuel here.
Well, the liquid kerosene, liquid oxygen works very well in the atmosphere, where the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen works better in outer space, which has better propellant propulsion rates.
Okay, the boosters
and
have
the
been
boosters
separated very
are
properly.
being separated. They come off to, because they burn out the fuel. They have to come up to allow the rocket to continue flying.
So now we see the core engine is burning, which is the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen.
So at this stage of the flight, what the rocket is doing is that it's accelerating in terms of speed, and until it reaches that height, it will continue to increase velocity.
Yes, it was increasing the velocity and altitude at the same time.
From this 3D animation, we can see the data link from the vehicle to different ground stations. We have ground stations at the launch center, and also have the stations in the Xisha Islands, and also at every critical point, for instance, before the spacecraft separation from the rocket, we also have the ground have space tracking ships in the Pacific Ocean.
The number we see on the screen is the number of seconds into the flight. So we're now more than 4 minutes into the flight.
At the current stage, the core stage work with the what's so-called the YF-77 rocket engines. We use 2 engines in this core stage of the Long March 5. Each have a thrust about 50 tons. So this rocket engine is the largest, as Mr. Xu has mentioned, the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen engine, which has the highest specific impulse in China's rocket engine families.
And the next noticeable development would be the separation of the first stage and second stage rockets. How long till we have that? A couple of minutes?
流水3901跟踪正常。
This is a camera video from the inside the payload fairing.
The camera seems to be working very well.
The payload fairing is jettisoned.
Okay, the fairings.
雷达跟踪正常，遥测信号正常，文昌飞行正常。
The fairings are at the very top of the rocket. They protect the spacecraft, basically.
Yes, once it's out of outer space, once it's out of the atmosphere. It doesn't create any frictions. So we have to lose weight as well as the boosters.
Absolutely.
We drop all of them to increase the propulsion ratio so that we can have better propulsion for speed and
Absolutely.
altitude.
So are we now out of the Earth's atmosphere?
Yes, we are out of. I think it's more than 100 kilometers above Earth.
The atmosphere is about 70 kilometers.
Yes, about 70 to 110. Yes.
Okay.
From the voice, we can hear that the telemetry data received from the Xisha Islands, the ground station located on the Xisha Islands, received the data, and it shows that the data is works properly.
2521遥测信号正常。
So normally there are 2 different kinds of observations. One is telemetry tracking, another is optical observations. So once it's above the optical observation capabilities, we'll rely on the TTNC, telemetry tracking control command.
As Mr. Xu mentioned, we have optical telescopes to observe the flying, and also we have ground-based readers to measure the trajectory of the rocket.
And that's what we've been hearing.
西沙3113跟踪正常。
Yeah, just now, as we've been hearing, those are personnel on the ground, some on the ground, some in Xisha Islands, tracking the flight of the rocket.
The voice mentioned the 313 is the trajectory tracking radar we use in every mission from the Wenchang Satellite Launch Center.
Understood. So now this will be actually a longer phase in that flight. You know, we've had the boosters come off, we've had the fairings come off, we've had.
But this is still the critical moment because the core engine has experienced a couple of times of failure in the past 4 missions. So we have to make sure that we witness the separation of the first stage with the second stage, and the core engine burns properly so that we can ensure the success.
The first stage used, as Mr. Xu mentioned, the cryogenic propulsion system with liquid oxygen as the fuel and the liquid hydrogen as the fuel and liquid oxygen as the oxidizer. It has a very high specific impulse, so this with little consumption of fuels, it can provide much more.
Now the first stage and the second stage.
Great.
Rockets are being separated. We're hearing applause from the controlling command center. Everything seems to be working just fine.
So the second stage, we use the YF-75D rocket engines, which also use the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen as a propellant. The thrust is smaller, but the specific impulse is even higher than the first stage.
And later in the flight, that engine on the second stage rocket will be shut for a while when the rocket is cruising
Yeah.
And there will be a second ignition later in the flight.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
So you can see from the 3D animation, we have data links from the from the ocean surface to the I believe that is a ground space tracking ship. And to the vehicle, and also as you mentioned, after this spacecraft, the rocket enters the what we call so-called the parking orbit. The rocket engine will be shut down, and we will have a coasting phase with no propulsions, and we will have the second ignition near the equator to have the lunar orbit from the low Earth orbit to the lunar transfer orbit. Now we can see the videos mounted from the camera mounted on the rocket, and also this is camera mounted near the rocket engine. We can monitor the working of the YF-75D.
You can see the flame coming down from the underpart, which is the burning of the engine.
And it says second stage engine right there on the upper right corner of your screen, indicating what this camera is showing us. And these cameras do seem to work extremely well in outer space.
And you see that because videos always have a very large amount of data, so the transfer rate from the spacecraft, from the rocket to the ground station, has a very high data transfer rate. So this is a very high requirement.
And how long is this process, until the engine shuts off for that brief period until it hits a second ignition?
It normally takes a few minutes.
A few minutes.
Yes. So it very much depends on the orbit that you are planning. So this is the translunar orbit. So it depends on different missions. So the timings are different.
So we're basically waiting for when the rocket and the spacecraft eventually hits that translunar orbit.
Yeah. We will have a number of maneuvers before it takes off to the lunar orbit, translunar orbit. And then during that course, we will have a number of corrections. It depends on the precision of the insertion of the spacecraft to that orbit.
What type of maneuvers?
It's like Professor Yang mentioned that once we're leaving the Earth orbit, we'll accelerate to the lunar orbit. And once we reach the lunar vicinities, we have to slow down, what we call a brake, to insert into lunar orbit. So that, and also we will descend gradually from a higher altitude, like 300 or 400 kilometers, to eventually less than 100 kilometers, so that we can prepare for the descent of the ascender and the sample return mission.
Well, you see from the camera mounted on the rocket, we can see that the rocket itself is already under the sunshine. Although we in Beijing here is still at night. Great. The first shutdown of the rocket engine on the second stage. So now we are in the coasting phase.
Phase.
Yeah. So it's already in low Earth orbit with altitude of about near 200 kilometers. We will fly to, as I mentioned, fly to a place near the equator and then ignite again.
Help us understand a little bit more about this process. When the engine has shut down and the rocket is coasting, what's happening now in this process?
So first, we need to know that because we choose this kind of procedure because of the location of our launch site. Because we don't have a launch site at the equator or near the equator, so we need this coasting phase to adjust its orbit. So the orbit is determined by the points where the engine is shutting down. So we need to have an orbit with the apogee near the equator. So we only have this choice to have a coasting phase and then ignite again, and finally it can enter in orbit with the apogee near the equator. So that's the necessity of this kind of to enter the Earth-Moon transfer orbit.
Mr. Xu, at what point do we know we can reignite again? What are we waiting to see happen
Well, probably you can see from the telemetry and tracking control ship that they will. It is near the equator. As you mentioned, the launch site is also near the equator. So we're adjusting the spacecraft to the equator, the Earth equator, so it can reach at the apogee point, as Professor Yang mentioned, and then we fire to adjust so that it will be in the flat face of the equator, and then increase the speed so that it can goes to the perigee, where it can have a longer and higher velocity compared to the current one. So as we call it, sling off by the Earth's gravity to the lunar orbit.
Usually, we also call this second burn of the engines a perigee kick. A perigee kick can be achieved by the second burn of the end stage, and can also be done by a separate rocket engine. Usually, for instance, during the years before, when the space shuttle launched a deep space probe, usually it uses this kind of perigee kick engine. It will be a very small, solid rocket motor. Well, because we know that for the Long March 5 series and of Long March 3A series, we have the capability of the second ignition. So we don't need this kind of separate motors. We only need the engines to shut down first and then ignite again.
So as we call it, to escape from the Earth gravity, the Earth orbiting satellites have a lower velocity, where compared to this mission, you go to the moon, you have to escape the Earth gravity. So we need to fire multiple times in apogee and perigee, and to sling off the spacecraft to the lunar orbit.
During this coasting phase, although the YF-75D engine is not working, but we still need to control the attitude of the spacecraft because we need the correct orientation of the antennas to send the data to the ground and also to prepare for the second ignition.
How do we do that? How do we maintain?
We use some other thrusters, some kind of small thrusters, because you know that at this altitude there will be no atmosphere, so we cannot use other measures. We can only use the rocket thrusters, but much smaller than the, as I mentioned, the main engines. So we use these thrusters to keep the attitude of the spacecraft and also the orientation of the antennas. But still, now we have the link from the rocket to the Tianlian data relay satellite.
This is a rather long process that will likely take a few more minutes until we see that second ignition again.
You see, now we can only see the 3D animation. This is because, as I mentioned, the videos, transferring the videos need to transfer a large amount of data. So only a ground station can do that usually. For a rocket, usually we don't have this high gain antenna to transfer videos. So you see in some phases there is only critical data transferred, so there is no video.
We're also looking at the flight time to the left of your screen. 1,038 seconds into the flight now.
So the second ignition is approaching.
The second ignition is approaching. This is what we call a coasting phase. It takes a few more minutes until we can see that second ignition happen.
So the second ignition is also a very critical step for this launch, and only a few countries can do this. If your end stage have the capability of the second burning, you can do a lot of work, such as the launching an object into a high elliptical orbit, which is very useful in deep space missions.
You know, let's leave it for now, because this will take another few minutes until we see that second ignition happen. I want to continue to talk to you about what will happen on the moon. When will we see the deployment of the lander on the moon?
Well, as Mr. Xu has mentioned, we have some instruments on board the lander, because you see we need to choose the samples and the samples must be collected properly. So we have a lunar penetrating radar which will measure the structure under the ground, and we can choose the right place, because you see we not only need to have a drill deep under the ground 2 meters, and also we need to know other references of this, but we must have done this within 14 days, because as we have discussed, the design of this spacecraft can only work in the daytime of the moon, and cannot work or cannot survive during the lunar night, which have very extremely cold environment. So we must do this with limited time, and also the scope we also must be designed very carefully. You have asked the question about it is automated or controlled by the ground. So we do have the data link between the ground and the lander, but you see that because the distance between the Earth and the Moon is about 380,000 kilometers, so there is a time delay. So for any actions on the lunar surface, we must consider this influence, and also the operations of the robotic arm, the scoop, and also the drilling, we must consider this. And also another challenge is the packing of these samples. We have the rocket course and 2 meters under the surface, and also have the reckless. We also need to consider the influence of the flames of the rocket engines of the lander, because this also will have influence to the samples.
Will we be able to see that process as it happens?
Well, I think there are a number of cameras that has been mounted on the spacecraft and the descender. I'm sure we will see some of the images. The collecting process might not be easily visible, but the descending and the ascending process we will see quite clearly, as we experienced that from the Long March 3 and 4. The Chang'e 3 and 4 missions, which has descended to the lunar surface and the rovers itself. So we do have cameras that is working very well, but as Professor Yang mentioned, the cameras and the images take a lot of bandwidth, take a lot of capacities of the telemetry and tracking system. So from the lunar surface to the ground will take some time to process, but I'm sure we will see some of the images.
The tasks ahead on the Moon, including the drilling, the sampling, the collecting, do we know how time is planned? Do we plan everything down to the last detail, or do we allocate this period of time for each task?
Well, this depends on the plans by the team itself. You see that there are multiple choices, and also after landing, as I mentioned, there are also many other important and critical tasks. We need to measure the accurate coordinates of the lander to prepare for the ascending procedure, and also
so this can be pre-planned in advance.
Exactly.
Everything will have to be.
So we have many multiple steps, and also as Mr. Xu mentioned, we have some instruments such as a panoramic camera. With this camera, we can see the images from the lunar surface and check the situation of the lander itself and choose where to get the samples. So this kind of operations can be designed after the landing procedure and then determined by the commander on the ground control.
Let's talk about, as you mentioned, samples. Let's talk about why we need these samples. By studying these samples, scientists say that we can better understand the volcanic activities on the Moon and the age of the Moon, maybe. So, Mr. Xu, how are we going to work with those samples that we make painstaking efforts to collect?
Well, these samples, first of all, have with the COVID-19, the word quarantine, but in our space sector, we also have what we call interplanetary quarantine. So this sample has to be properly sealed to make sure that it doesn't have interplanetary infections, like with what we call aliens, maybe some other germs,
like what you see in movies.
Yes.
Like you can.
So these has to be very carefully handled, especially sample return missions. Secondly, is that the samples, once returned to the Moon, to the Earth, we will have scientific communities to study very carefully. This will be beneficiary in number of areas, including chemical areas, including mineralogical, petrological, isotopic, and geological. So there are many domains that we can study the samples and tell a lot of stories from the lunar surface and in connection to the development of Earth and in the universe as well.
When the samples are brought back to Earth, will it only be China studying them? Could it be shared with other countries?
Obviously, it will be shared by other countries. There are examples before. You see that during the end of 1970s, the U.S. gave 1 gram of the lunar soils as gift to our country. So we have some, we studied these kind of samples and have some articles published on very important, very influential scientific journals. And also, there are examples that the former Soviet Union and the United States exchanged their samples. You see that although the Apollo program bring back about 881.7 kilograms of samples, but these samples are from 6 different locations of the moon. And the former Soviet Union gets samples from 3 different locations other than the United States. So they exchange their samples and they get more meaningful scientific research results. So this time I believe we will get our samples, and no one has get samples from this we call the Mount Rumker, which is at the northwest edge of the Ocean of Stop, which is the largest lunar mare.
This is an unexplored region.
Exactly. So, so this region, it's relatively young. You see that other samples from Moon have a history of 3 to 4 billion years, while this region is only about a history of 1 billion years. Yeah, 1 to 2 billion years. So I believe these samples will change our view to the Moon, especially to the history and evolution of the Moon. And with this study, we can have a better understanding of all the hypotheses about the formation of the Moon, and also together with the history of the Earth-Moon system.
You know, when it comes to cooperation between countries in terms of its, their respective space exploration programs, some say, this is just about competition. You're going to have an advantage in your space exploration, whether it's lunar or other celestial bodies. How do we understand China's space program? Is China in competition with other countries, namely the United States and Russia, or is China in a better place now to cooperate and collaborate with other countries?
Well, as we have discussed, China is a developing country. We develop our space programs according to our own needs, either an engineering goal or a scientific research goal. So we don't compete with other countries, and it's meaningless for us to compete with other countries. So for this kind of scientific research, they're always top one, because you know that for scientific research, we get to this place, and it is we to get the first to get into this place. But we, as we have discussed, we also will have exchange with other countries to have different to have the samples from different places. So these kind of activities or studies will benefit not only one country, will benefit the whole humankind. So I believe that this kind of operation will be a win-win game for all these space capable nations, and in the future it will be an inevitable trend for these kind of countries to cooperate together. I am a member from the Moon Village Association and the only founding member of the Moon Village Association from China. And our goal is to promote the cooperation between different countries, either between the governments or between the space agencies, industries, or universities.
Mr. Xu, your take on this?
Well, I think, there's a European saying that competition works faster than cooperation.
We're hearing that the second ignition is taking place as we speak. Now 1,600 seconds into the flight, almost 1,700, the second ignition has happened.
So this second ignition of the rocket will accelerate the spacecraft from the speed of 7.8 kilometers per second to about 11 kilometers per second. So that will be the Earth-Moon transfer orbit, which will be a very high elliptical orbit.
And Mr. Xu, help us understand what we're waiting to see here after the second ignition.
So after the second ignition, we will see this increase, as Professor Yang mentioned, increase in velocity. So with the basically the spacecraft is in the equator, above the equator exactly at the moment. So we will increase the speed so that we can just reach the transfer velocity. So it can go to the lunar orbit at the appropriate, like we call it, perigee point.
It will take another few minutes until we know whether we have hit that orbit.
Yes, because the second stage uses the quadratic propulsion system. It works longer. It works longer than the first stage.
It's very interesting because a lot of people watch this say that for all these efforts and for all, the challenges that we will encounter in the later stages of this mission, the samples brought back to Earth don't have immediate impact on our world today. All the things we talk about, understanding the moon, understanding how it was formed, understanding the age sort of the moon, and dating all of those volcanoes, they don't have an immediate impact on our lives, on our world now. Professor Yan, how do you say to people who are rather confused or who don't understand why we go through painstaking efforts to do that?
Well, you see, for space activities, there are direct returns and indirect returns. For instance, navigation satellites, the Earth observation satellites, the communication satellites, which have served our daily life directly, so we can understand that and feel the necessary and the importance of that. But for other scientific research missions, such as the manned space activities and the deep space missions like this Chang'e-5, most of the returns are indirect. So it is our duty, it is we, staff of the employees of the space industry, to give a connection between the public and our space field, to let the public know the importance of our activities and know the returns, the great returns from this space activity. There are examples. Analysis shows that the Apollo program, the manned lunar missions, have a return rate of more than 6 or even 11. That means that $1 invested to the Apollo program, there will be returns to the whole society more than $11. So that is only a very limited analysis. So you see that it is very necessary for us to introduce the importance to the public.
Are we looking for the returns here, multiple times returns here, or are we looking into a future that could benefit all mankind, Mr. Xu?
If you see that the number of satellites that is working above us on the Earth's orbit, we can say that you can tell the difference and the importance of space by switching off the space infrastructure for one day. Then you will see that you can't tell the weather, you can't tell where you are, the navigation shut down, your phone shut down, the communication shut down. So everything will shut down. So from these lunar missions, we'll see that this is the very first step to become for humanity to become an interplanetary species, so that we can go to other celestial bodies, even planets. This is a very first step that we take as a human being to be a spacefaring species.
Let's indulge ourselves here and expand our imagination. With this step, we're endeavoring with the moon. What could the moon do to mankind here on Earth? Because people have talked about energy, right? People have talked about possibly relocating the population to the moon one day. Just help it. When we expand our imagination, what could the moon do?
Well, moon is not the ideal place for immigration. So in the future, it is only an outpost of human being. And on the other hand, the moon have a very plenty of the helium-3. Helium-3 will be a very ideal fuel for the potential fusion power, which can solve the problem of energy supply of human being. It is said that the helium-3 on board the lunar surface, can be used by human being to supply energy for us.
Years.
Yes, for more than thousands of years. So that is a very potential utilization of the lunar resources. And also because, as we have discussed, there are water ice on the lunar surface. So in the future, we can utilize this kind of water because you know that the moon is much smaller than the Earth. To lift off from the moon is much more simpler than the Earth. So we can use the water to make propellants. So the moon can be a potential outpost for the human being to exploration and exploitation of other celestial bodies of the solar system. So there is one choice. If we want to go to Mars, we can use the moon as our basis and produce the propellants and prepare for these kind of missions.
So you can see from this picture, it's a great picture, seeing that you can see from the Earth from the spacecraft. So it was a great image from the lunar orbiter. So the Chang'e-5 is taking picture of the Earth's surface before it goes to the moon.
Yes, that is a beautiful picture of this blue planet we all call home here. And this is the second stage engine, as it says on the upper right screen.
So this is a camera mounted with a direction to the backwards of the spacecraft. So you can see the background is the blue bubble, the Earth. And
isn't the next development the deployment of the solar? Are we looking?
It will be a separation. Once it's shut down, we'll have separation of the second
It's
stage.
shutting down again. We just heard from.
Yes, we can hear the voice that the second stage is shut down.
It's
so the next
shutting
step
down.
will be the separation of the spacecraft with the end stage of the rocket.
Yes, we're looking forward to seeing that separation of that spacecraft and the rocket, or what's left of the rocket.
The voice also reported the shutdown of the small rocket engines for the correction, a small correction of the orbit to make it more accurate.
What does that indicate? What does that tell us?
Because the YF-75D have a very big thrust, so we need small engines to correct the final orbit to make it more accurate.
So
And
that means it's already in orbit.
It's already in orbit. We're now about 36 minutes into the flight. We understand the spacecraft is already in orbit. We're waiting to hear official announcement about the flight.
Well, you can
from
see
Control and Command.
From the image, you can see this spacecraft is very stable in relative to the Earth. So now there's a separation.
The separation of the spacecraft and the rocket. This is a crucial step in the flight, indicating now that
the separation is confirmed by the telemetry data, which can be checked and examined from the ground and also from the camera. We can. This is a video from mounted on the end stage of the rocket, and we can see. You can see the thrusters of the orbiter of the Chang'e-5.
So the spacecraft is now on its own, which is what we intended for.
So
it's now in orbit.
So the next, critical step will be the unfolding of the solar panels of the orbiter. With this step, we will have continuous power supply to the spacecraft.
And we can see the unfolding of the solar panels, right? Do we have cameras that will show us the unfolding of the solar panels?
I suppose so. So we also, as we have discussed, we need the telemetry data to be transferred to the ground. So this is still the engine from the rocket.
So basically, in layman's words, we're fine-tuning the spacecraft as it hits that orbit now. It looks like we still need a couple more minutes until everything is in place and we might hear an official announcement about the status of the flight. Let's talk more about what's going to happen with the main mission this time, the sampling and the returning of those samples.
景山，我是文昌。
What about the challenges of the return capsule? We know that they will return to Earth, they will re-enter the atmosphere at very high velocity, and then it will land in grasslands in Inner Mongolia. I suppose that's what's going to happen. Talk to us about the potential challenges there.
You know that we choose to recover our re-entry capsule in the mainland of China. You know that the difference from the manned missions from the low Earth orbit is that we don't have much choice, and also the window is very, very narrow.
Professor Yang, are those the solar panels we're seeing there?
No,
I can't quite make. So the solar panels have not been
so we still need the report from the ground staff to report this.
I'm sorry for cutting you off. Please go ahead.
To achieve this goal, we choose what we call the skip re-entry, which means that the spacecraft, the re-entry capsule, will not descending to the ground directly. It will descend from the outer space to about the altitude of about 60 kilometers high, and then raise its trajectory to go back to outer space again, and then going down. To have this kind of measures, we can adjust the landing point in a very wide range. So with this measure, we can land this spacecraft to our mainland of China, or otherwise we will have to recover this spacecraft in oceans. So you see, the United States choose the oceans to recover their Apollo spaceships, but we don't. You see that this needs a very large-scale rescue ships, rescue fleet. So we choose this, which can reduce a lot of the cost, but this makes the complexity of the mission itself. You know that the re-entry capsule is a very small one, much smaller than the Shenzhou spaceship. So the tracking of this re-entry capsule is very difficult. You see that tracking so small spacecraft like this Chang'e-5 re-entry capsule with a speed nearly 11 kilometers per second is very, very difficult. We have experienced this during the Long March-5 T1 missions, but that's very successful. And also, this kind of trajectory tracking will be very critical for us to get a very precise prediction of the landing place, and also to have the rescue teams to the place at the first moment.
And Mr. Xu, before I get to you, help us understand what's happening here with this picture.
This
visual.
is what we call the separation of the spacecraft with the rocket itself. So the spacecraft is in a status where it has integrity checking, self-checking, and also sending signals back to Earth and waiting for the command to deploy the solar panel. So we have just heard from the command control center they have received some information from the TTNC ground stations. So they will very soon send a TTNC signal to the spacecraft once everything is validated, and then it will deploy the solar panel and readjust its attitude with the attitude control systems, either small propulsions or gyros. So it will then face a period of time where it will orbit in the equator orbit of the Earth, and then accelerate later on to the translunar orbit.
How long until that acceleration?
It will take a number of circles around the Earth, and then validate everything and make sure that the spacecraft is ready. I think is in 1 or 2. Within 1 day, I think it will send a signal, and then it will go to the translunar orbit.
So basically, information and data as we speak are being sent and validated by ground controlling command. After they do that, they can give instructions to deploy the solar panels.
As you see that these spacecraft is not always above the Chinese territory, so we're using a lot of overseas TTNC networks. The deep space network of ESA has been used for these cooperations, including the cooperation with the European Space Agency and Argentina is part of this effort. So we're using overseas telemetry tracking control stations in connection and linkage with the Chinese network, so that we can have a constant monitoring and control of the spacecraft. This is very important, very precious cargo of our nation. So we have to keep an eye constantly on this spacecraft.
That's definitely what we'll continue to do here on our program, keeping a close eye on the Chang'e-5 mission. Professor Yang, Mr. Xu, I want to thank you so much for your expertise, your explanations, and your insight today on our program. Thank you so much. And that'll do it for our special coverage of the Chang'e-5 launch. In the following days, the spacecraft is expected to bring back the first batch of lunar soil and rock samples in over 4 decades. Stay tuned to CGTN for the latest on Chang'e-5 as it makes its way to the moon. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. On behalf of the entire team, thank you so much for the privilege of your time.